Hi, this is Paul. Big day today. The Peterson, Pageau, Vervaeke, Bishop Barron conversation just dropped. I was just finishing up the PowerPoint for this conversation. And it's a short week, and family is coming in town, and extra service, and. I was in church all day yesterday. 3.5 hour Nigerian Anglican ordination service. So while I didn't have any time last week to deal with it, the Symbolic World, Jordan Peterson posted a lecture that Jonathan Pageau gave to a Zoom group of a Jungian group about Genesis. And Jordan began with a little intro explaining why he thought it was important, and he posted it in conjunction, in a sense. He tagged it onto his Genesis series. It's a fascinating move. Is Jonathan Pageau's work a psychological take? This is really interesting. A lot of people have said, you should do a commentary on this. It's kind of an end-to-end commentary. So much of this is Jonathan presenting in an orderly way a lot of what he presents anyway. So at least at this point, I'm not planning a full walkthrough. It's a very worthwhile video. I thought it would actually be more helpful to situate the video, because I think a lot of people will watch it and have difficulty sort of framing the video and understanding how this fits into the very long-standing conversation about the Bible and modernity and how to read it. First thing I want to say in terms of motivation, go all the way back to Jordan Peterson's classroom lectures that are on his channel. One of the things that I gleaned very quickly from that is we see obstacles and opportunities. Now, again, obstacles and opportunities are not physical things like this Sharpie. We see obstacles and opportunities. Talk about exaptation, talk about relevance realization. This is what moves us. This is what motivates us. This is the spiritual direction that brings us through the world. Now, with Pageau's lecture, he begins the lecture just talking, and he's talking in a fair amount of abstraction, and I think a lot of people will get lost and turned off almost right from the start. Those who are Pageau fans, those who are Peterson fans, especially Pageau fans, they'll hang in there because it won't be too difficult for them to understand what he's talking about and what he's doing, because they've watched him talk about this and do this for so long now. But for many people, I think they're just going to be completely lost initially. So actually, one of the better places to start is towards the end with the questions and answers. And what was very interesting were these questions and answers, because these were the kinds of things that ignited Jordan Peterson's status rocket and really brought a lot of fans into Jonathan Pageau.
Okay, there's two more psychological questions. I'm going to tell them both together because I think they are linked. And Jordan, you may also have something to contribute to that one. How would you work with the problem of inclusive, exclusive categories in these times? Projection, scapegoating. And the other question I think is related, where do the movements of cancel culture or Black Lives Matter fit, or how to make sense of these movements into this intelligence model?
Now, these are applications of everything that he did before in the talk. And so for many people, what hits obstacles and opportunities will be a question like this. Okay, something applicable, something concrete. Am I against this, or am I for this? What's my judgment with respect to a specific thing in the social context right now?
Yeah. So one of the things we're seeing is we're seeing out of control versions of this identification system, or the system of communion. The way in which reality works is fractal. And so communities or identities embed themselves in each other. That's how it works. And so in a normal kind of traditional world, you can be a family, in a neighborhood, in a community, right? In a nation, in a church. And it's like, it's all embedded. And you can also participate in all these different identities. You can be in a club, or you can be in this and that. And so it all kind of works together. So one of the problems we're having right now is that, let's say, kind of woke culture has understood the problem of identity, right? They understand it. They understand the problem of exclusion. But the answer they give is that they want to account for everything. They want everything to fit. Now, the problem is that it's impossible. It's an impossible, and it's even a danger.
And now his answer is pretty abstract, because when they say they want everything to fit, they want everything to fit into their framework of, in a sense, a certain type of exclusion or oppression ought to be at the top of a hierarchy, and everything is subservient to that, and it goes to absolutely everything in life. It goes to all of those types of social questions. It goes to all relationships.
Dangerous thing. And there are a lot of ancient traditions which help you understand that. So, for example, like you have the idea in Jewish law that you have to leave a fringe on your vestment, or you have to leave the corners of the field untilled for the strangers. All of these patterns are there to manifest the fact that you can't have a system which is both coherent and complete at the same time. You can't. Those two things.
Let me interrupt just for a second.
Go for it.
Well, the ziggurat answers that question too, because people can be included at a higher level of unity and excluded at a lower. And so part of this is conceptual confusion. It's like the problem of category is the problem of inclusion and exclusion.
Okay, and that's really helpful, the problem of category, because how do you categorize a person? Because all of us are multiple categories at once. And this is part of the main point that Pageau makes right at the beginning of the talk, where he talks about the fact that when you look at me, you see an individual identity. Now, you might say, I see a man, or you might say, I see a big beard, or you might say, I see a Protestant minister, or I see Paul Vanderklay, but there's a thing, and that aspect exposes and covers other aspects of mind, because it's multiplicity. You might say, you're looking at me, but you're not looking at all of me. I'm covered with clothing. You're only seeing from here on up. But again, in terms of how the world lays itself out, how we process the world, this is how attention and category and all of these things hold together.
Exclusion can lead to demonization very easily, and that's a big problem, a fundamental problem. But the problem that you're talking about that's manifesting socially is a consequence of this lack of understanding of the hierarchy of value. So the people who are pushing diversity, inclusivity, and equity are saying something like, look, we're all divinely human. And you object to that by saying, well, yes, but we still need to differentiate ourselves into specialized categories. And we have to think through that very carefully so that we subdue things properly.
No, exactly. And so
now subdue, he made a point earlier, but this would be a classic Jordan Peterson clipism that if someone hears subdue right away, they're going to run with it, such as enforced monogamy, et cetera, et cetera.
What's happened is that people want to make inclusivity the only value, really the only value, because of the problem of exclusion. And so what happens, and this is what I'm going to say is going to seem radical to some, but what we're seeing in this process is the actual destruction of the world. And it's actually going to
Okay, right there when he says the destruction of the world. What happens with many people is a tiny little mental picture of a globe with lots of people on it. Now, this is not anything any of us have ever seen. They may say, well, I was up in space. Well, there might be one of you out there, and I doubt anybody who's ever been up in space ever listens to my videos just on the basis of odds. But when you're up in space, you didn't see little people on the globe, did you? It's this mental picture. And I've gone over this with C.S. Lewis's book Miracles about London and the train station that he would always go into. Now, we know these little mental pictures are fabrications, but right away when he says here, the world, that's what we think of. And this is our material, modernist conceptuality expressing itself.
Seeing in this process is the actual destruction of the world. And it's actually going to, this type of thinking can actually destroy the world. Or...
And again, when people hear that, it's like, whoa, because this is this picture of the world. But you have to understand how Pageau, through this video, lays out the world.
Lead to absolute tyranny, one or the other, or maybe one because causing the other. Because, so imagine you have a basketball team, right? You have a basketball team. The purpose of the team is to play basketball, to win the championship, to do this. But then you say, no. The purpose of the team is inclusion. And now imagine you do that for every single level of reality and every single communion. You say that the purpose of your group is inclusion. But so then you sacrifice the actual purpose of the group, which is to play basketball, to win games and everything, for inclusion. And you end up doing that in all aspects of reality. What you're doing is you're devouring the purpose. You're eating it. It's like it's becoming eaten by this thing. It's a monster. It's like it's the potential. It's like potentiality is infinite. It's like you need to let all this potential in. And so we were like, this is wrong, right? You're excluding this potential. So we need to kind of bring all this potential in. So what it does is it's like a sea monster that comes up and devours the identities. And so either it brings about a kind of fragmentation and chaos and breakdown, but often the world can't sustain itself that way. So what it tends to do is it tends to lead into a kind of absolute identity. And it's weird because the way it seems to be happening, it's just the strangest thing, is that it's like people are trying to make inclusivity as the tyrannical system itself, which is seems like it's not possible, but that seems to be what's happening, is that inclusivity is going to turn into tyranny. But what's important is that gesture is going to create something like absolute scapegoats. Absolute scapegoats, which is that those that will refuse to participate in this weird principle of inclusivity will be absolutely excluded. It's the only sin, and it's an unforgivable sin. And so we're moving toward that, and it's kind of scary to see it happen.
So that's his application of it. And for many people, once they hear that, maybe they've been a victim of, or they feel themselves to be a victim of a system that has done this. Maybe someone else got preferential treatment on the basis of a policy of diversity, inclusivity. For some reason, then you hear this, you say, oh, okay, Pageau sees the world aright because from my standpoint epistemology of being the person who was excluded from a system on the basis of these new policies that are given more and more power, I assume Pageau's version of the world is right. Now, suddenly, all sorts of things start to lay out for you with respect to how you see Pageau and what his work is doing. And the same thing happened with Jordan Peterson. So for you, this is the application of betterment, because you say Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson have a better view of the world than the HR department at work, or the admissions office at school, or the woke politician that you feel is threatening your proximal betterment around you. And so now I listen to Jonathan Pageau. He seems to have an argument that stands up against this, because this was a very powerful system that seemed to be morally right because it was against racism. We agreed racism was bad. And so this seems to be, this is at least being touted as the next advancement of anti-racism, even though many people look at it as, in fact, another form of racism in the name of anti-racism, and on and on and on and on that thing goes. Now, religion is always and politics is now. So we usually take the proximal betterment, we take the now, and we find someone who is voicing our proximal betterment, and then so we begin to align with them, and then down the hierarchy, it's like a whole bunch of dominoes, tick, 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 tick. Now suddenly I've been red-pilled, or the script has been flipped, or for some reason the world turns upside down, okay? Now, key to this, in terms of understanding Pageau and Genesis, because that's where we're going, is that I view the world. The world cannot be viewed from no place. Now, part of why this is difficult is because Christianity and other religious systems have really tried to tamp down egocentrism. And if you say the world is viewed by me in this way, we sort of have an anti-egocentric bias in the culture that says, no, I can't talk that way. No, I can't think that way. But key to Jonathan's approach to the world is perspective. See, if I say it that way, it doesn't trigger our anti-egocentric biases right there. Now, Peterson, of course, was working psychologically, and how this plays into this conversation is rather interesting, and how then Peterson applies Jonathan's talk here to his working on the book of Genesis psychologically is a really interesting question. In all of this, we have beneath it the quest for the universal. And that's something that we shouldn't forget, because in some ways, what Jonathan is doing is substituting the modernistic universal perspective, which I call the monarchical vision. You go up from on top and you look at the world, view from nowhere. Actually, it's a view from above. We imagine we see the world as it is. We think we're seeing and we think we're prioritizing objects. This is the quest for the universal. And we'll get into why this is. Well, why do we chase the universal? We're always chasing the universal because we're always chasing the frontiers. And the universal is always beyond the moreness. And we have suchness and moreness, another Vervaekeism here. We're always chasing the moreness. And so the universal, because it's beyond what we see, the universal is always beyond the moreness, and we're always sort of chasing it. We're pursuing it into the future. We're looking for something that will give us the ability to wield everything towards any end we desire. Notice all of the universals in there. Something that will give us the ability to wield everything towards any end we desire. That's a very universalist framing of it. And it comes with the resistance to claiming that we will... No, I don't remember what I was saying there. And betterment is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. So we have this desire for betterment. We have this desire to make the world better. That's a very universal. We have the desire to make our lives better. When Pageau was talking about the basketball team, if you were a basketball player and let's say you had an injury, a career-ending injury, you would say, I lost, my world was lost. That's how we talk. It's because that's how we think. It's because of the perspective that we're employing. Now there's proximal betterment, and that scales out. There's ultimate betterment, and that's this chase for the universal. And then there's absolute betterment, which sort of obliterates in the way that Hans-Georg Müller was thinking about Wittgenstein and the absolute. So you got to be a little careful with absolutes because they tend to just blot out everything. But ultimate is at least the degree to which we can attain, or the degree to which something can be attained. It's not exactly the same as absolute. So what happens here? Let's see. Did I plan on a? I did plan on a clip with respect to this universal.
How sure are you about the universality of heaven and earth distinction? As far as I know, it is symbolic pattern appearing with the axial age cultures, Buddhism, Christianity, Socratic Greece, Islam. Animistic culture, for example, do not have clear distinction between those two categories. So by extension, what makes you sure that all of this isn't just a perfect exposition of an axial age mind?
How can I say this?
So he goes off here. A lot of my argument about the registers has been that, well, this is part of an axial age mind. And I think this aspect of mind is why, and I'll go into, well, let's just hear him go off a little bit, because this was quite interesting.
This. Now I'm going to go back into what I'm saying. Which is about embodied reality. People who talk about the axial age and animistic as if they don't exist in the world, I have very little patience for that. Like, where are you? Where are you to tell me about the axial age as if it's something which you're not in, and talk about the animistic age as if it's something that somehow you can see from outside? Like,
if you want to see 4 hours of Pageau frustrated with this, go back and watch his conversations with Adam Friended and his conversation with Rationality Rules. That's all of those talks were stuck at exactly this point.
This, how can I say this? It's like, we don't know much about animistic religions because we're not animistic religions. We're always interpreting animistic religions from the place where we are. And so to me, it's always strange. It's like, do you know the secret traditions of the shamans? Mm-hmm. Where you read the text that some European went out into Tibet and wrote some text based on what they encountered there. Were you initiated? Right? Did they bring you into the secret of secrets? Did they tell you what their secret traditions are? No, they didn't. You don't know them. And so I'm not saying that the comment is true or false. I'm saying that you really know less about these traditions than you think you do. Because the way you know about something is not by studying it from the outside, but it's about encountering it and living it from the inside. And those that are initiated into the higher mysteries, they're not supposed to talk about it anyways. So they're not going to tell you. So even if a scholar was at some point maybe initiated into the higher mysteries, they shouldn't tell you. And if they tell you, it means they probably weren't initiated and they're bullshitting you. Right? This is true, like even of the Eleusinian mysteries. Everybody talks about the Eleusinian mysteries as if they know what they are. It's like, that was a pretty awesome thing because no one ever told anybody what happened there.
Right.
And if I tell you, I'll have to kill you. I mean, you have to put that on. So what he's getting at here is a function of worldview that modernity chafes against. Modernity and monarchical vision says everything is subject to analysis in our ways. We see the whole world, and someone says, you don't see my world. Say, yes, I see your world, and I can explain your world. Now, with all of the tensions with respect to standpoint epistemology and a bunch of the tensions over racial or gender exclusion and exclusion, my lived experience, the secret sacred self, all of that this has to do with the question of, well, now we're saying that modernity can't see some things. Modernity can't see that deep inside I really am Natalie Wood, and I am pretty, and I'm so pretty, and I'm so witty and pretty, and yeah, I might look to you like well, I don't even look that big on YouTube, as everyone who meets me say, you're a lot shorter on YouTube. But when they meet me in person, they're like, oh, I don't look like Natalie Wood. I don't look like Shirley Temple. But if I have my secret sacred self as Natalie Wood or Shirley Temple singing about the good ship Lollipop, well, too bad for you because you're not privy to my world. Now, this is an aspect of what Jonathan is doing here, and let's get to the next. So if you go a couple videos ago on my Neo-Paganism, Christianity, and the Rest is History, this gets into these questions because Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook asked Ron Hutton, why don't we know anything of ancient paganism? Why do we know so little of the Druids? Why do we know? And Ron Hutton attempts to answer that, But part of the answer is actually in Pageau's answer here, which is they couldn't communicate it to you. Why? Well, they didn't have books. They didn't have sacred scriptures. One of the things that happens when you get these axial age religions that have sacred scriptures is now suddenly there are things that outside people can observe. Now, there remains some of that internal dynamic because the folklore and the paganism, these shamanisms, they don't actually disappear, because they're actually incorporated into it. For example, even if you look at, let's say, John Calvin's ideas about the Holy Spirit and Scripture, well, the Holy Spirit shows you how to read Scripture. Now, from a modernist perspective, which is, again, everything is out in the open, everything is visible, everything is possible, that is simply dismissed and declined, because there can be no such thing, because everything is acceptable and open and accessible to everything else. That's part of modernity. The ancient world didn't see it that way, and now, well, what about Pageau's system? What do you do when you write? So what happens when you had the world religions is the world religions basically mow all of the paganisms and the folklores and the animism. It just completely consumes it, and in fact it subsumes it. Because what tended to happen in that old world was whenever you encounter a rival pattern, you either submit, obliterate, or assimilate, incorporate. Those are really the three options. And this had been going on for a very long time. And, well, what happens then when the worldviews come along, the world religions come along, these world religions are totalizing. And what happens when they encounter each other, well, that's when you've got submit, obliterate, assimilate, incorporate. Those things come into play. And then you have conflicts between them. And what modernity does, really as a function of Christianity and secularity, modernity comes along and looks at it and says, no, there is no secret knowledge. All knowledge can be made visible. All knowledge can be propositionalized and put out there in the open. And in doing so, what we tend to do then is we sort of obliterate personhood. And the subject is destroyed. There are no people. This takes a long time for this to sink in. We have the meaning crisis because first we're obliterating all other subjects, and then suddenly we look in the mirror and say, am I subject to obliteration by modernity seeing all knowledge as propositional, just flatly there? And then suddenly you have a meaning crisis because there's no there. There's no ghost in the machine. There's no homunculus down inside making big PVK move. And so this has been the process that's been going on through history. Now, one of the interesting things is that people are not offended by Newton, even though Newton himself was deeply religious, and even though his mechanics are not as universal as it was once imagined. They don't scale fully to both ends as everyone imagined it would be. Now, with this little illustration from National Geographic, universality is implied symbolically in this. We have a telescope, we see the moon, we see an image of the sun and planets in orbit, we have a prism. It's all sort of this secret initiation for those who have the power and the technology to open up the world. And that's sort of the mythos behind science. After the discarded image was discarded, we looked for a new universal. Look at what we call the universe and why we call it that. And so we imagine, well, via modernity, we can see all of this. There's a neat video that someone who follows me on Twitter pointed me to, actually has the maybe we can play it. I think it's actually germane.
So, you want to know, what's this meta-modern business?
And I don't know that meta-modern is a concept or a term that's going to catch on. Postmodernity is now pretty much taken and nearly worthless at this point. And so now we're looking for new words for what is beyond modernity.
That's all about.
I had read this Metamodern manifesto.
Some would call what you endorse to not be modernism, but in fact Metamodernism.
A lot of our audience really wanted to hear your commentary on Metamodernism and Hansi Freinat.
Метамодерн — это колебание.
Metamodernism. To get at what metamodern means, first you have to get a grasp of what traditional, modern, and postmodern mean.
Now I thought this video was really... Oh, see, I don't even have it on the screen right now. Let's put it up on the screen. I'm all in a rush. I'm all in a rush.
Here's a quick crash course. Traditional refers to ways of living and thinking that were long the norm in human culture. Think the Middle Ages. Here, religion is incredibly important, and pretty much everyone understands the world through the lens of religious stories. Of this world.
I don't know if everyone understands that. I think people think they understand it. But again, back to Pageau's point, unless you're sort of living inside of it, you can look at someone else and you have these labels and you have these descriptions and you can explain. But now notice that Pageau is sort of an amphibian here. He's explaining, he's taking pre-modern and explaining it in the modern, but that's why Pageau always says, well, you have to go to church, you have to participate, you have to embody, yada, yada, yada.
World and the other world beyond. Most people work the land and live in kingdoms run by monarchs or lords. Things don't change much, and that's seen as a good thing. Everything has its set place in the great chain of being. There's a natural order to things, laid down by God. And one does well to play the role they were born into within that divine hierarchy, while seeking their ultimate heavenly reward in the other world after they die.
Now, there's a lot of selection, because you can't help, because every time you speak, you have to select. You select words, you select concepts to forefront, etc., etc. So there's, he's trying to compress a ton of stuff into this, and these are what people imagine, especially from an egalitarian modernist perspective. These are sort of the salient points that we overcame in order to achieve the modern world.
Eventually, though, the traditional came to be replaced by the modern. Modern refers to a perspective based on the critique of traditional presumptions and articles of faith. Think the scientific and industrial revolutions. Religion and its other world notion here loses its unchallenged authority as more and more people come to understand.
And the moon is incredibly important because, of course, the moon was the beginning of the heavens, and when Galileo and Newton say, well, mechanics on the moon are exactly the same as mechanics on Earth, suddenly you lose the ether and you lose all of these aspects of the discarded image, and now the world is significantly more flat and subject to math.
And the world through scientific and materialist models. Most people work in factories, living in cities run by bureaucratic governments. Things change a lot, at an accelerating speed, and this is seen as a good thing. This is progress. There is no social order.
Now again, notice everything is flat. Everything is horizontal in some ways, even our pictures of it. And anyone is allowed to go in the store unless you're a homeless alcoholic and you keep robbing the store. And then they kind of say, businesses have the right to exclude anyone for whatever reason they want. It's like, wait a minute, really?
Order of things set down by God, but the possibility of a true meritocracy in which people can change their own lives for the better. One does well then to...
Henry Ford is a seriously ironic picture in what he just described.
Try and improve their lot in the world in the small span of their single human life. Sorry, no afterlife. Eventually, modern yields to postmodern. Postmodern refers to a perspective based on the critique of modern presumptions in articles of faith. Think the anti-war, civil rights, environmentalist, and social justice movements. Here science loses its unchallenged authority as more and more people come to see other modes of knowledge as equally valid. Most people work service jobs and live in post-industrial urban or suburban centers. There is no one narrative or story for life, only numerous perspectives. That whole progress trope, that was just a modern secular religion. Not coincidentally, it served those in power. In fact, because what counts for merit in the so-called meritocracy is only determined by those with power in the social order, and always at the expense of groups or identities deemed marginal or outsiders to insider values, one does well to dedicate themselves to activism aimed at correcting these power imbalances by seeking a redistribution of power. Got that? The traditional, the modern, and the postmodern, each one supplanting the previous. Now, this process can be viewed historically as the movement through different cultural periods, or it can be viewed philosophically as the movement through different epistemas, or ways of knowing. Or it can be viewed developmentally as the movement through higher and higher stages of understanding and cognition. However you interpret it, everyone agrees that these represent a sort of series, a progression of different modes or structures of thought. Okay.
Everyone is a big word in modernity. Is a big word.
So much for the traditional, modern, and postmodern. Now we can finally talk about the metamodern. The metamodern follows after the postmodern. It is then, in broadest terms, a post-postmodern paradigm, and thus a perspective based on the critique of postmodern presumptions and articles of faith. This corrective is accomplished in important ways by reintroducing...
It's interesting the way certain things linger, such as experts. You got David Foster Wallace. Oh, okay, so he's the one that gets to announce. He's the one that gets to announce postmodernity is done, and it's validated because he killed himself, I guess.
Ideas, sensibilities, and practices from before the postmodern back into the cultural conversation, but, and here's the crucial part, altered now by their interaction and recontextualization through postmodern critique and awareness. In this sense, metamodern refers to a perspective based on a critique of the postmodern and an attempt to reintegrate the perceived merits of previous perspectives, including the postmodern.
So that would sort of put Pageau as a metamodern, but again, I don't know that these labels are necessarily going to hold sway with everything we've got going here. But that's I thought a very helpful video, and it was clear, it was easy to understand. Modernity is going away. It fails to incorporate the subject. It fails to incorporate standpoint epistemology. It fails to incorporate the perspective that not everything is available to the modern. Not everything is available and applicable and achievable from it. And the pattern, the subject, of course, is the pattern, seeing the pattern. Now, Pageau's world, in that sense, is sort of metamodern, if we're going to use that phrase, because it reincorporates the subject. And, of course, Pageau would say, and I think he's being as fair as he can, that he is trying to articulate a traditional world, but he now can't unknow what he knows about the modern and the postmodern. So, in fact, those will be elements of his perspective. So his perspective isn't simply, let's say, a traditional perspective naive to the modern and postmodern. And in that way, metamodern or beyond modern or symbolic. And so the symbolic world has the reincorporation of the subject, and it tries to recapture what modernity has lost, but now we're still using the internet and computers, and so we don't want to lose everything that modernity had. This gets into the lab leak, what I call, because the lab leak is, we learned, Galileo on top of that tower learned to, well, will one of the balls fall faster if I pray for it? So in a sense, in the lab, you exclude the subject. If anybody goes on the same tower with all of the same variables and drops the balls in exactly the way Galileo did, then they will always fall at precisely the rate that Galileo measured. That's behind the scientific method. Now the lab leak is you take this one trick. You take this one perspective and now you apply it to everything. And that's exactly what modernity did. Applied it to theology, applied it to the Bible, applied it to human nature, applied. And what happens after the lab leak is that, in a sense, the virus sort of expends itself out there in the world. And then those who are fundamentally committed to what's happening in the lab want to say, hey, wait a minute, this has got to stay in the lab. We can't just destroy all the labs because of the lab leak and because of the destruction and the difficulties that the lab leak created for us. So now what's interesting is that what Pageau is doing here is, in a sense, offering a certain validation of the symbolic world by demonstrating how this can make Genesis make better sense. And, this whole sense making, obviously Rebel Wisdom's talked a lot about it. What does that mean? What do we mean by sense making? It offers a more coherent picture of the world. So we're still hungering after universalization, because part of the problem was, well, we had Genesis and then we had science and we couldn't put them together. But now with this new perspective, we can afford both Genesis and science, and they're no longer butt heads against each other. See, modernity had a hidden preference, because there's a little trick that modernity did in this lab leak, which was that, well, there's certain things that sort of got smuggled into it. And so what fundamentalists didn't appreciate when they didn't appreciate the change that had happened inside of them and the change that had happened all around them and the consequence that change would bring on how they approached the Bible. And this is part of what modernity couldn't really capture. Modernity couldn't see the changes inside, the changes in the pattern that was looking at the other patterns. And so modernists were reading a different Bible. You'd say, yeah, but all the words are the same. And we took a great deal of care to make sure that all the words are the same. Now, in a certain place in here, Pageau complains about modern translations. And that's right. If you watch my adult Sunday school class, I spend a lot of time in that class talking about words. And at this point now, lining up 6 different English translations. We take a look at usually the LEB, which is one that probably you don't know much about, the NIV, which is a very popular one, and then the New Living Translation, which is not really a translation. And then we're looking at David Bentley Hart's translation, which is very interesting, and N.T. Wright's translation, and Eugene Peterson's paraphrase. And when you line all these together, and usually I'm in the book of Romans, so I'll have the Greek text there too, things become interesting. And so with my Sunday school class, I have to sort of walk them through all of these different layers. And part of the beauty of the Sunday school class is they indulge me in the generosity and benefit of time, taking a long time to go through this. Because modernity has framed the world, but the frame looks hidden. And materiality and linear time are, in fact, part of the frame. And so when someone through modernist eyes reads Genesis 1, they have certain assumptions that they are bringing to the text that may or may not be shared by the authors of the text. And of course, postmodernity became good at bringing this out. Literary criticism, if you look at the work of Robert Alter, they brought these kinds of issues out when it came to reading the Bible. And what happened when fundamentalists didn't understand that they were reading with new eyes, modernists probably didn't understand it either. None of us can fully comprehend the changes in our pattern as we're looking at other patterns. Now with this, we're in danger of falling into a certain solipsism, but we have no other way but to risk it. And so when one thing is framed, many other things are obscured. That's, in fact, the reason for a frame. C.S. Lewis points out that we tend to see in pictures. And so part of what I like doing with go to the Google Zeitgeist image search and just search solar system, and you get all of these pictures. And so when I say solar system, a bunch of these pictures have been embedded into your internal mapping, and that's what you think the solar system is. And what we fail to see is that we see all these objects, and these objects are set up sort of in pretty pictures that try to relate certain aspects of them. So if you search solar system, suddenly then you see things like, oh, come on, show me the whole picture. There we go. Oh, but all of these are symbols. And, oh, are those words floating in space? And then, of course, many things we don't see, like, hey, wait a minute. Those are Roman gods, except for Earth. Why would that one be doing? And Sun, well, but Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and then you go to another one and just notice how oh, wait a minute, now this one shows different relations. Oh, now, well, that doesn't make any sense. Oh, look at this one moves. Oh, that one moves faster. Oh, now we're getting into questions of size. Well, where are the little names? And, oh, now we're getting into questions of scale and distance, and oh, now we've got a pretty swirly thing with colors, and on and on and on we tend to go with these types of, and now we're going to look at the progression, etc., etc., etc. But these pictures all have frames, and you have to include and exclude, and what Pageau is masterful at is showing you that you're seeing these things. And in that way, postmodernity is sort of included in that, but trying not to fall into the pit of postmodernity, which is this individual solipsism. And so what developed in the modern period were all these concordisms. Now, I've used this word before, and a number of you have said, well, what do you mean by that word? Well, if you look at like creation science, that's a concordism, because you're sort of trying to take temporal succession and physicality and understand the biblical text in those terms. And I recently had the Fallen Earth Creationist on the channel, and he tries to, well, here's a new way to map this in, and but notice what you keep is a particular approach to reality, and you're trying to take all of these pieces and fit them into the other picture. And others try to sort of dismiss this and say, well, Genesis is a metaphor. And Pageau would kind of say, no, because that word isn't getting at the truth of Genesis and how reality lays itself out and how the world comes into being. But now when I say the world comes into being, you might think, well, we're going to have to think either 10,000 years or 16 billion years. Notice all the conclusions you jump to, which you need to jump to conclusions in order to understand language. Okay? There has to be a frame of reference that you employ. And part of the reason Pageau is so difficult to understand is that he is employing different frames of reference. And this is why you got to feel bad for Jonathan, because he has to keep repeating himself and saying the same things over and over, and talk to Rationality Rules and he doesn't get it, and talk to Adam Friended and he's not getting it. And you know, I've listened to Jonathan over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and you know, just I think increasingly coming to understand what he's saying and trying to find other language, because this is what preachers do. We take two worlds and we try and connect them and find ways for the two worlds to try to meet. I guess I'm a Jonathan Pageau ally in that sense. So so there's all this concordism with hidden modernity, and people are always looking for these allegories. So I remember when I was in Christian middle school, and a bunch of these allegories were presented to me, the gap theory and the Gish theory, and ways of trying to sort of account for Genesis 1 with evolution, or just breaking the frame and saying this is the way it happened and all the science is wrong, and then looking for all kinds of anomalies in the science and trying to fit a cohesive picture together this way. But when I was in seminary, it was quite clear that the page was turning, and this concordist approach wasn't really cutting it anymore, and people were simply giving up on that project. But they weren't quite sure then how to read the ancient text, because in a postmodern frame, modernists say, well, it's all out in the open. A postmodernist will say, well, you can't know anything. Well, that's not satisfying. And so this metamodern approach says, well, let's see if we can continue to learn, and maybe we can understand the relations. Now, when Jordan Peterson was doing his Genesis series, that's why I called it a psychological concordism, because he would take aspects of psychology and he would map them onto Genesis. And once people saw that mapping, there was then a relief about, oh, good, I can keep my Bible. Metaphor or imagery or mythology sort of served that too for, let's say, modernist Christians, but other things continued to slip, because if the Bible is just this outdated ancient mythology, then it stands alongside other outdated mythologies, and then you say simply, like a lot of celebrity atheists, well, Zeus and Yahweh are the same thing. And this is part of the reason I've talked about Ezekiel Kaufman and revolutionary monotheism, in that, no, in all fairness, even from a modernist point of view, where we're trying to at least compare what we can, there are some really radical differences between Zeus and the Lord. Even though Jupiter by Jove, there's just, history is really complex and really long, and a lot of people have been mashing things together for a very long time. And so the allegory sort of goes away. And but then again, with Jordan Peterson, there was sort of a psychological concordism, that here are these psychological things in the world, and oh, look, we can find testimony to the psychology in the Bible, and you just didn't worry about physics or anything else like that. John Walton did sort of a similar thing with the Lost World of Genesis 1, where he's saying this isn't talking about materiality, but he didn't have as developed a system as Pageau is using. And so this is where the symbolic world, in a sense, Pageau is asking his adherents to step into a new worldview and begin to see the world through new eyes. Now, part of the advantage that Pageau has with this is he is in some ways saying that the Orthodox, he's already got an institution with buildings and frescoes and art. You can occupy and step into the symbolic world and then inhabit it. Look, I am already. And that's part of the way that Jonathan, and in all fairness to him, he would have all kinds of humility and yeah buts and getting into it and yada yada yada. This has been part of the big attraction for many people. Why started with Jordan Peterson, then Pageau, and then Orthodox curious, and then some get into orthodoxy. Again, my take has been that's not going to be the end of the story or the struggle. Now, maybe for some, they'll be happily within orthodoxy, and I celebrate every time someone enters into the Orthodox Church. That's A-okay with me. But I suspect, and more of this is bearing out in conversations that I've been having, often with people offline, that, well, it's not such an easy fit. And orthodoxy is a very demanding discipleship. And again, it's easy to say, well, you putzes and people who can't fully submit, yeah, you're going to suffer for your lack of submission. And part of that is true. But I wonder, see, this is where I'm exactly in between Vervaeke and Pageau, because I'm a Protestant. And and Protestants are used to having a degree of flexibility in the construction of these worlds in order to try to accommodate some of the disruption that has gone through the system. And I thought Pageau's, I really loved this video. This was a terrific video. And I was amazed at how he laid this stuff out, and wow, it all flows so nicely, and it does. And this is a fantastic interpretive key of Genesis 1. Now, it's not the only interpretive key. Every description is limited by its frame and context. You can't have an absolute description because, as Pageau says, you can't fit everything in. This is a function of the limitations of ourselves. And so, for example, John Walters in the Lost World of Genesis 1 sort of emphasizes the temple, and he tries to, he doesn't do it anywhere near as elegantly as Pageau does, because again, what Pageau is able to do is, with this introduction, in a sense, welcome you into an entire system which is still present, and to one degree or another, increasingly accommodating and doing the difficult theological work to bring it all together. And I suspect the Orthodox Church in America is going to be having some interesting decades, as on one hand you have an ethos that is now benefiting it of not changing. I mean, go back to my conversations with Nathan Jacobs. It's very clear they don't change. But going to it is a change for the individual. And we like that moving out into the universal. And so for Jonathan Pageau, the symbolic world is more universal than the cross-pressured evangelical world and the postmodern world of art school. The symbolic world is more universal. And this is, again, part of the real difficulty that John Vervaeke and his, that's not being fair to John. It's really hard to be able to talk about this because why Christians have this enormous advantage is because we've got the buildings, we've got the institutions, we've got the books, we've got the material, we've got the communities, we've got the allies, we've got the schools. Now, all of it is fraught to one degree or another because Jonathan Pageau is sort of a vanguard of orthodoxy, but not every Orthodox priest, when you walk in, is going to sound like Jonathan Pageau in vestments. It's not going to be that way. And now there's some that you can find on YouTube and in their podcasts, and they might be your shining light. But that's an enormous advantage that Pageau has in terms of welcoming people into the symbolic world and offering an avenue of participation. And you can get in a car and you can maybe drive for an hour or two to get to an Orthodox church, and you can participate, but you don't really escape all of the phases that have come before. Ideally, you would walk to your Orthodox church, and everyone who lives around the church would be walking to the Orthodox church. Same with a Protestant church, and it's not too many generations ago that Southeast Grand Rapids, my grandparents walked to their church, and almost everyone who lived around them were from that church. Same in Prospect Park, New Jersey, Dutch Hill, New Jersey, bingo, right there. I seldom mention Prospect Park. If you need me to say Patterson just so you can get the bingo, there it is. So, but that world has been pulled apart. And so you're not actually going to have the same Orthodox experience. Now, if you, like Burn Power, move all the way to Tbilisi, Georgia, where there's a church next door, Burn Power now walks into the church and, oh, they're happy to see him and he's a good guy, and the longer he's there, but he'll never really be part of them. Because now we have all of the other layers that are here. But what's beautiful about Pageau's system of Genesis 1 is you don't have to dig up fossils and play all this creation science concordism to validate and verify the truth of Genesis 1. It's there before your very eyes. The world lays itself out in this way, and Jonathan is expert at showing how it's laid out here. This is, and he says it again and again, this is how reality lays itself out. The subject is now incorporated in this, and the elements are so universal and so at hand. Once you become accustomed to seeing this, you can live in this world. It's LARPing. I mean, just Grim Grizz has all the elements in his videos. I know some of you are like, that Grim Grizz is so weird. But Grim Grizz has he really embodied it? Have you really embodied it, Grim? See, Grim is sort of on the outside. Says Grim is a fringe character, and this is part of Grim's ethos in his videos, that he's not using this beautiful Sony camera like I am. He's not using this fast Sigma lens. He doesn't have this moderately priced Yeti Blue mic. He's in and out and virtually not alone, and he's leaving. If you think the rough edges are in my video, his rough edges are even more, and so he's signaling fringeness, but all of the little things, the LARPing, remember, embody, you have no agency, we want what's best for you. I mean, Grim has all this stuff in there. That's why his channel is so good. But he doesn't take the time to walk through things step by step like I do. And you get the sense that he's a bit of a sea monster. But Pageau is doing it, and he's doing it well. And here's the way the world is. Do you want to live in this world? Join an Orthodox church. Yeah, but then once you get to the Orthodox church, there is a great deal of reality in the Orthodox church that you didn't have looking at your Pageauian screen and listening to the symbolic world. Now, you might go down to the local Orthodox church and you're expecting, again, to find Jonathan Pageau investments, and this is what you find.
This is Christopher Petcu, and welcome to a different symbolic world.
Old MacDonald had a farm.
I'm not trying to do anything against the Orthodox Church. I want people to go there, but this is part of the reality of... Just reading my messages. I shouldn't do this while I'm recording. Now, this participates in a very, very old thing. I've been working with the book of Romans and the Apostle Paul. Paul was, in many ways, trying to propagate a view of the Bible in the Roman Empire. And now, if you listen to Jacob from the Bridges of Meaning Discord, he has very very unfriendly things to say about the Apostle Paul. He does not like the Apostle Paul. But this is what Paul was doing, and this is what I, as a minister, do, and this is what Jonathan Pageau, this is what Christians do. And what happened in this struggle was we tried to save the Bible for faith, and you can find biologos.org. I just noticed that biologos.com leads to some, I don't know, like you buy chemicals or something from them, but biologos.org. you've got all these ways of trying to either set it to the side or integrate it, or science and faith working hand in hand because we know we're not going to get beyond this. And people can see that technology works, and technology is, we grab onto technology for proximal betterment as we continue to go through time. Often the limits of the proximal betterment of technology manifest themselves, and so we wrestle with this. But what we want from science, and that's the terms we use, it's not the most applicable, is we want to wield nature. We want to feel certain, and we want to behold pleasing patterns. And, I thought Tammy's, question for clarification was quite apt. In Darwin, I thought Darwin was the enemy. And with Pageau, it's different from, let's say, theistic evolution, which was something that's sort of been tried for a lot of people. In some ways, Pageau just basically says, no, this is what Genesis is talking about. And that isn't threatened necessarily by science. Pageau's got all kinds of other critiques of science because science is part of modernity, and this is the anxiety of the IDW, and can science be restricted to the lab, and can the beneficial pieces of modernity be saved even as it's under assault by the postmodern and whatever is actually beyond the modern that we're heading into, whether you call that metamodern or whatever language you use. Those who still want Christianity can feel a bit at ease. The Bible is safe from Darwin. And in fact, I think one of the ways to understand Jordan Peterson's impact on people was he actually used Darwin to justify the Bible, but not in the concordist sense of earlier generations. He had a psychological concordism, and most of what people want from the Bible is a degree of validation and hope that the Bible can yield them wisdom in a way that a lot of the modernist churches really failed to do. In fact, the numerically most successful wave of church growth in the last 50 years has been the seeker movement that simply used the Bible for wisdom, didn't really worry too much about questions of evolution, and on the basis of biblical wisdom, used that as credibility for the church. And then for the most part, used standard modernistic language to talk about, I'm about to use a theological term, soteriology. You basically had modernistic Protestantism in that they used for that frame, but for the most part using wisdom and community and all of those things, which would tend to outperform the absence of such things for many people. And that's really where the seeker movement took off. The seeker movement had some liabilities, however, which were eventually manifest in the emergent movement, and emergent movement split into three branches, which were the progressive evangelicals, and the young, restless, and reformed, and then now really the neo-sacramentalists. All three are moving, and I would say probably the neo-sacramentalists are the closest to what we're talking about here in terms of what's happening. More attention to liturgy, more attention to symbolism. And again, I've been following this for a long time, long before I found Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Pageau. Now suddenly we're seeing this in the broader context, and we're seeing other voices come online. Now, what happens to, let's say, Peterson and John Vervaeke and the more ardent secularists who are staying away from traditional religion, that's really where we get more into the Vervaeke camp. And again, I think part of what we're seeing in the segment that has Pageau, for Christians, we've got the buildings, we've got the institutions, we've got worlds of literature, we've got practice, we've got all of these things. It's terribly, terribly difficult to construct a new way of being, and far easier to adapt an older form and to recalibrate and tinker. And I think that's in fact what happens, whether you're conscious of the recalibrating and tinkering or not. So those who still want Christianity can feel a bit at ease. The Bible is safe from Darwin. And in fact, now via Jordan Peterson, you have Darwinian arguments for the credibility of the Bible. Even look at that credibility, credo. We're not getting rid of propositions. We just sneak them in different forms. We're not getting rid of credo. It's always going to be there. Now, this can be compelling and verifiable. It feels cutting edge than many of the rearguard concordisms of the past 150 years. But there is, again, nervousness about the church, and we hear that coming from Jordan Peterson's. So Vervaeke talked with Sam. Vervaeke talked with, I think he talked with Paul Anleitner. There was another conversation. Vervaeke was on Grail Country. I haven't had a chance to listen to all of these things. And then Pageau on Genesis, which I just finished listening to this morning, and then drops Pageau, Barron, Vervaeke, and Peterson. All of this week. You're crushing me, people. You're crushing me. I'm big, but I'm not that big. Y'all are going to have to wait, I don't know how long, for commentary, but I might live stream a little bit of first look at the Pageau, Peterson, Vervaeke, Barron talk. And Pageau, they clipped right out of the gate. It's like, what do you, and it's not Jonathan's fault because that was in context. I don't know who's doing Jordan's, the person who's doing Jordan's stuff today knows a lot better what they're doing than some of the ones who have done it in the past, because you can tell because of the relevance realizations, and they sort of know where the conflicts are. And Pageau comes out swinging at Protestants right off the bat, at Calvinists. I was listening to the Nigerian Anglicans. I was in there for 3.5 hours yesterday, and yeah, a lot of Calvinism in that Anglicanism, even filtered all the way through Nigeria and back to the United States. It was just quite a fascinating thing to watch. They rent space from us here, and they had this ordination service, and their bishop came in, and the venerable was asking if I would please attend so they could thank me, and yada yada yada. It was an absolutely fascinating, delightful way to spend 3.5 hours, but cuts into your video time, folks. The church is always about application, and egalitarianism feels so liberating. There's nobody better than me in action and knowledge and morality, or maybe there is. The church makes demands on my attention, which is worship, demands on my energy, money and time, demands on my allegiance, identity. The church makes demands. And again, if you listen to Jordan Peterson in part 1, and I haven't listened to part 2 of the podcast, all of his anxiety about the church. Are you going to plant a new one? Really? Really? You got a big fan base, but nothing compared to, even if Vervaeke and Peterson could get on the same page, which I doubt they could. It's just hard to compete with something so old and so big as these world religions. And in many ways, the conflicts between these world religions are the titanic conflicts. And to make it even more complex, Christianity is so subtle and supple. It in some ways colonized the world via secularism. Tom Holland, setting the stage for more conquest in terms of Christianity. So I look at these conversations and say, y'all will be Christians soon. I think it's coming. And even in Jordan Peterson language, you're way more Christian than you ever imagined. And so the transformation of attention, energy, and allegiance. The utility of the church for betterment. Betterment must scale. We're always judging by proximal betterment. We're looking for ultimate betterment, telos, resolution, consummation. The business about Darwin and telos, I thought Sam made that argument. Did I ever make a clip of that? I should have. It was a good thing. Maybe I can pull it up. Got the city coming here in a half hour. So all these application things you got to do as a pastor, and everything needs to get done in this time of year. It's a mess. Look at this. Sam's been doing work. He's got 717 subs. I haven't even really pushed him that much, but Sam's a brilliant guy. Oops, I don't even have the... And he makes much better videos than I do. He's doing this church fathers things with Hank, which was absolutely hysterious. He had a conversation with Byrne. Come on, the first Vervaeke conversation. Got to find it. Luke, of course, Jacob, all of these characters that you can find in your Bridges of Meaning Discord channel near you.
Maintain.
All right, now you see he's a good YouTuber. He does all of these things. Yeah, here's the section. This is a clip on its own.
Scale properly. That's why I've taken the position I'm taking.
So here's why I might push back on that a little bit.
Please.
So there's a couple different ways I think to talk about sort of purpose in biology and evolution, right? So like the purpose of a polar bear is to hunt seals in the Arctic, right? So they are white because so that they can sneak up on seals. The purpose of their whiteness is so that they're harder to distinguish from the snow around them, so that the seals can't see them as easily, right? And they're big and fluffy because it's cold. Right. And et cetera, et cetera. There's purpose in all of the sorts of aspects of a polar bear that are sort of, all centered on their purpose, which is, hunting seals. But, the polar bear isn't aware of its own whiteness, probably not, as the reason why it's white. It knows to, when they're sneaking up on seals, they cover their nose, right, with their paws because their nose is black, but they probably don't know why they do that sort of thing, right? It's like at the level of instinct. So I'm sure there's, polar bears are probably, more, well, they have some level of cognition and that sort of thing, but there are purposes that are not in their own mind that they're acting out. And I don't think that you would disagree with any of that. But I feel like it's almost like the theory, the process of evolution, the mechanism of evolution, the ability to encode a form, right, in sort of, DNA and that sort of thing. And then to translate that into a form, into, there's the DNA of a polar bear, which can get translated into an actual polar bear. And then, the polar bear has more polar bear offspring if everything goes well. That mechanism of, information, embodiment of information, but also the search algorithm, right? Each child's a little different. There's some randomness, and the randomness is useful, right? The randomness is because the environment changes, or we're not a perfect polar bear yet. There's still room for improvement in polar bearness. And that it's almost as if the purpose of evolution is purpose itself, right? Like there are a lot, there's the purpose of an alligator, the purpose of a beetle, the purpose of a maple tree, the purpose of all of these different things. And they have lots of different sub-purposes and make their livings in lots of different ways. But it's like life itself is searching for purpose itself, I would say. And that, there's nothing, the process of evolution isn't thinking this, right? It doesn't have a mind in that sense, but it is almost like it is the bottom up, emergence of purpose itself.
So I think that's great. And I, when I said representation, I didn't mean necessarily consciousness. I think parameciums have sort of internal chemical processes that track things in the environment so that let's say when we talk about teleology, we're talking about agency. Then let's try a different term.
Okay. All right.
So paramecium is an agent. It doesn't have awareness. It doesn't think, but the paramecium can in some sense detect the consequences
to the best of our knowledge
of its behavior and then change its behavior, right, in order to maintain.
Unless in Vervaekian terms, thinking is something we more do between each other than inside of each other, which is why I've recruited you for my third lobe.
It's autopoiesis. It's a self-organizing system that is self-organized so that it can detect conditions that will preserve or threaten its structural functional organization. And if that's what you mean by purpose, yes, living things are on purpose. That's what distinguishes an autopoietic thing from a merely self-organizing thing. Autopoietic things are self-organized such that they seek out the conditions that will promote their continued existence. So I agree with that. And I didn't mean to attribute anything. I think I fumbled when I used the word foresight. That brings with it, and I apologize for that. That was careless on my part. I meant more this ability to detect forward and adjust. So I think wherever there's agency, it is, and I mean it for like the paramecium, it is appropriate to talk about purpose. And I think living things are precisely the things that generate norms for themselves that they then bind themselves to. And merely self-organizing things like fires and tornadoes don't do that. So they're a subspecies of self-organizing thing. And
actually, it's a question from Tammy, so I'll let her ask it.
How did Darwin bring Plato back?
Because by coming back into the world of biology, he inevitably brought back purpose-driven action, or selection is the best way to understand it, right? He brought back the idea of selection, and selection is not chaos, right? Selection is not random. Selection is purpose-oriented, and it's purpose-oriented towards the perpetuation of the seed, the perpetuation of the identity. And so
this is the argument that I've been trying to put forth with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. It's like, you guys, there's a big contradiction here between Darwin and Newton, or the way we look at Newton. It's like, this is a big problem.
And so it's a surprise. It's like, it's a surprise, I think, that nobody kind of expected, and nobody necessarily framed it completely that way, but it did end up bringing back the idea of quality back into the picture, right? Because you
Sevilla
choose for a reason, and the reason is something which is closer to your own, the perpetuation of your own identity.
Yes,
and it's like
crafted by evolutionary forces. And so meaning itself is a consequence of the evolutionary process, and how that tangles up with the...
And you might figure out the relationship between God number one and this.
Like the theological perspective that you brought to bear today, that's an incredibly complicated and difficult problem. But as you said, God calls the earth to manifest its potential. So...
yeah.
God number two, it's the agent. God number one is the arena.
And so you could, how can I say this? It's like, so you can see it bottom up, which is, I mean, I've been expressing it more bottom up recently, just because people are kind of scientifically minded. But you can see it completely top down. Like you can see it as like I was trying to explain to you, as these. The evolutionary process of maintaining your identity is a reflection of a deeper pattern, which is a cosmic pattern of how the world actually unfolds. So it's not necessarily that evolutionary process brought about this. It's that the reason why evolutionary processes work the way they do and do what they do is because they're functioning within a larger system.
Yes, so
they're functioning within, they're imaging, they're manifesting the way the world works. So that's how the world works.
That discussion of subdue starts to become so relevant, because as creatures make their choices and live or die by them, what they are in fact doing is the spiritual process of subduing. And if they do it improperly, then they perish.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's an image, like we were talking about the idea of man at the outset, you know, and so this is represented in iconography, for example, as the image of Christ, Jesus Christ, human Jesus Christ creating the world, which is just like, for people, it just freaks them out, because like, how does this work? How is this possible? But that's the understanding. There is a manner in which how can I say this? And there's a manner in which, just like we have this Christian idea that Christ acts as an axis which transforms the past and the present, let's say, which kind of acts as this central axis. You could say that intelligence, as it manifests itself in the world, does the same. That is, the human person, human intelligence, goes back into the past and makes sense of it, and goes into the future and makes sense of it. And so you could say that intelligence is at the outset. The things don't exist outside of this capacity to contain them in consciousness. And so
right there. And if you get that little nugget from Jonathan, you'll go a long way to understanding the entire thing.
So the world is born in conscious.
And that's the fundamentally different turn from the modern, which is sort of an imaginary frame up into the heavens, a monarchical vision to look down on everything. Jonathan is looking through.
And the past as well. The past is born in consciousness too. So all those processes that people try to understand, all the Big Bang and all this stuff, it's still born in man. Like, it's still born in consciousness. And so the real origin is not the Big Bang. This is going to be the weirdest thing you're going to understand. The real origin is the intelligence, which is able to even perceive the Big Bang or see it as a pattern, as not just a quantum field which never changes. It's like perceiving change, transformation, identity, participating it. Like, that's the origin of reality. So the description in Genesis is like
it's a fundamental frame shift from modernity. It's fundamental, and it's for that reason it's really hard for people to sort of think in this different way.
I'm trying to help you see that it is an actual description of
actual. That word in that sentence is vital. Actual, right now. Genesis 1 is actual. No, Genesis 1 is in the past, because you look at that book and it's right at the beginning and Revelation at the end. Pageau isn't denying a linear conception, but he said, no, it's actual. The validation of Genesis 1 is all around you right now. That's his argument.
The origin of the world. It's not an actual description of the origin of the world. It's not a metaphor, like in the way that we want to think about it. It's not just a fairy tale, which is helping us understand things we don't understand. It is describing the manner in which reality originates. And it originates in meaning, then phenomena, not phenomena. Phenomena first as a puzzle, right? I talked about that, like this potential that bubbles up and calls to be answered, and then meaning which comes down. So you can see the same from all scientific theory is like that. It's like something presents itself as a puzzle and you're like, what is that? And then here comes the logos, the seed, which comes in and patterns it or identifies it, judges it, separates it from other things in the way that happens in the first chapter of Genesis.
There's the whole thing. In many ways, that's the whole thing. So betterment must scale. And back to the church, the utility of the church for betterment. And that's the crisis. And in many ways, again, as I said before, yeah, I understand Peterson's complaint. For every one of his complaints, I could probably have 10. But I don't know any other way than to go into it. And we're always judging by proximal betterment. And we're always looking for ultimate betterment. We're looking for communal betterment. And again, Peterson's articulation of the Piaget's equilibrated state, I think, that imaginatively was super helpful for me to sort of to gain a vision. Again, we're used to sort of thinking in images, to gain a vision for just betterment moving out into the world and for a way of imagining betterment. And then we're looking for cosmic consummation, which again is the theological language that we use. We scale all the way to the absolute. And to have a satisfying system, the absolute has to be a part of, because we're not satisfied with just having a concept of the absolute without having some instantiation or imaginative image of the absolute. And that again is what the Bible what the Bible gives. Now, how that works out, I mean, there's tons more to say about this, but this is how we're talking. So, John and Sam had another conversation this week, and John, there's like 4 Vervaeke conversations that I have to listen to. And of course, you know, Barron, oh, it's a nightmare. But I got to end the recording now. The city's on its way. Got to negotiate with them over an easement. It's a crazy world. Leave a message or leave a comment. What are we doing here? Leave a comment. Remember, embody.